I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Bradley Horowitz. Bradley is a vice president and advisor to Google, where over the past decade, he has led many of Google's consumer products, including Google Photos, Google News, Gmail, Google Drive and Docs, Google Voice, and Google Calendar. He has also led Google for Startups, an effort to foster opportunity for entrepreneurs worldwide. Bradley holds a master's in media science from MIT, a bachelor in computer science from the University of Michigan, and is presently a Cornell Fellow. He and his wife, Irene Wu, are avid angel investors with over 100 investments and advisors and supporters of the tech startup community. Bradley is joined by Alexandr Wang, CEO and founder at Scale. Alex, over to you.
Bradley, thanks so much for being here. Super excited to be chatting today.
Yeah, me too. I'm so happy to be here. The last time I was here, this office was Slack. So it's been many years.
Yeah, well, I'll ask you about that later on in the conversation. So there's a number of sort of parallels between both of our paths that I'm sort of excited to talk through. One of which is sort of both of us grew up in non-coastal major metro areas and sort of over time found our way into tech. And I wanted to start there. You know, you grew up in Detroit, and I wanted to ask you, how do you think growing up in Detroit influenced sort of how you thought about tech and your approach to tech, and ultimately your sort of interest in technology?
That's a super interesting question. Detroit is a fascinating place, and you know, it sort of rose to glory as an industrial city, and it's a city filled with makers. You know, this sort of Midwestern, sort of Rust Belt, hardworking group of people who built cars. And I had uncles and cousins who worked in tool and die and were literally machinists, sort of, you know, making things out of metal. So I think that's part of the Detroit ethic, is this sort of maker culture, which has sort of re-blossomed there. If you go there today, there's all kinds of, you know, everything from craft beers and hipsters, but there's still this sort of makerly sort of thing. For me, tech was really not part of my personal history or my family's history. I grew up working in a flower shop. That was the family business. And you know, I learned a ton, and I sort of applied that, and I hated it when I was doing it. I was 16 years old and wanted to go hang out with my friends, but instead I was standing there like a fool watering flowers all summer long. But the nature of that business is that if you're not out there on July 4th watering the flowers, you have $10,000 worth of inventory that just burns up, it burns to a crisp. And so part of what I learned is grit and determination. And I also learned a lot about just the basic rudiments of business. You know, it's the simplest business in the world. We would drive to Eastern Market in Detroit, and we had to be first there. And there's a little bit of an escalation to be the first there. So for us, it meant about 3 in the morning, we would get in the van and drive the van there. I used to lay in the back of the van and sleep while my dad drove. He'd grab my toe, wake me up, and then I'd spend the next 4 hours basically loading up the van and walking the market, buying from the vendors. We'd take them back, we'd put them out, and we'd sell them, and this is the key, for more than we paid for them. So, you know, we learned a little bit about inventory and accounts receivables and business, and, you know, and I think even that sort of very visceral experience of understanding how to run a small business is something that really informed things later. But something happened along the way, and I was very fortunate that at my high school, they got an Apple II. And you know, in about a week, I had exceeded the math teacher's ability to teach me anything on it, but fortunately, books and libraries. And so basically, a friend and I literally took that thing apart, put it back together, made it dance, and I spent every spare minute that I could sort of hacking. And when I went to college, and I have a stepdaughter who's going through the college application process right now, she's thinking about where to apply and essays and all of that. Neither of my parents went to college, and so I went to the state school. And the first time I set foot on campus was the first day of class. I sort of got there and was a kid in the playground because they had lots of computers. And I spent the next 6 years of my undergraduate education, and it took me 6 years, really digging into computers. I didn't care as much for class, except computer classes where I could actually learn something. But the access to the state-of-the-art machines for the time was what really inspired me.
Yeah, that's a great. It's awesome, and I think thinking about obviously AI today and drawing the parallel, maybe somewhat of a contrived parallel, but the computers at that time were, by today's standards, obviously incredibly weak and sort of unable to do most things that you'd want to do. But I'm sure the sort of like promise of the technology was ultimately incredibly exciting.
Yeah. As an undergraduate, in return for access to the computers, I used to do things like write device drivers that would literally, rip pixels out of the frame buffer, line by line. I did that for Ramesh Jain at the AI lab, who went on to be a great mentor and friend of mine. And then Emmett Leith in the optics department had a liquid nitrogen cooled camera, and I would write drivers for that calibrated it. And I learned a lot, starting sort of on the metal and the importance of data, like calibrating that machine. He was measuring photons, and it needed to be super calibrated. So part of what I loved about that time was sort of learning the lesson of garbage in, garbage out, and sort of spending huge amounts of my effort trying to calibrate these things and set up the system such that downstream we could actually do interesting things. But yeah, the computers of the time were pathetic and really, really weak. But I think, as you've sort of heard, those constraints of having really weak computers made us really clever and really taught us the basics of writing efficient code and things like that. So I think that's one of the themes of my career, is that constraints actually lead to good outcomes. So the constraint of having to deal with limited memory, limited CPU power was sort of helping us build up muscles and superpowers that we'd use later.
Yeah. Well, speaking of constraints, kind of like me, you ended up, so after undergrad, I think you went to MIT for grad school, and then you dropped out to ultimately start a company. So tell me a little bit about that story.
Yeah, again, neither of my parents went to college. When I told my dad I'd gotten into MIT for grad school, he was like, Michigan, and I was like, no. And I really enjoyed it there because, as I said, I was not a great student. Even my undergrad was a slog, and it was partly because I was really promiscuous. I was taking classes in cognitive science and art and music and hacking all day, and so not much for taking tests or getting good grades. So based on the recommendation of my mentor, Ramesh Jain, I was able to get to go to the Media Lab, and the Media Lab had just opened at MIT. I arrived in '89 and it had opened in '85. And it was a super cool place. I mean, I really felt like I had found my tribe, mostly because, oh, you like to hack? That's all we do here, welcome. And so they sort of sat me down, and I was really surrounded by people that I considered heroes, just the people that had literally written the books that I had studied. And computer vision in particular, which was sort of my chosen path. There were 5 incredible labs at MIT, all competing with each other, all with a slightly different spin. The AI lab, CSAIL, they had theirs, of course. The Media Lab had theirs. And then there was the Brain and Cog Sci department, where they were putting electrodes in cat brains and sort of looking at biological vision and things like that. So it was an incredibly exciting place, and it was a place that I felt was really great for me. But yeah, I dropped out like you.
And then, and what was the inspiration? Why did you start a company? And what was kind of the, what led you to that?
Yeah, so before I dropped out, I had done some research on non-rigid motion, and it's sort of a corner case. There's a lot of structure for motion that was going on, but non-rigid motion was something that was sort of underexplored. And I thought it was a really...
And maybe just explain that really quick for everyone.
Yeah. So thinking about how to explain it, I think I'll sort of shift to a different line of research that was happening in parallel. And at the time, it was called eigenfaces. And this is the research of Sandy Pentland, who was my advisor, and Matthew Turk, who was another grad student. And I think it won CVPR Best Paper like 30 years ago. And the basic insight there was that if you're going to do face recognition, the set of all possible faces in an image set is much smaller space than the set of all possible images, if you think about white noise even, So treating those like matrices, they did a principal components analysis and came up with the underlying eigenfaces, the set of basis functions where you could do a linear sum. And it turns out with a small number like 17 coefficients, I can do a linear sum of these eigenfaces and tell the difference between you and me. And it's a fascinating insight, and it taught me a lot about data, a lot about how to reframe problems and sort of find what is the most discriminating factor there. It's another sort of constraint problem. So my own research was on non-rigid motion. And that is a very unconstrained problem, but it turns out that objects in the real world are subject to the laws of physics. Like, atoms don't spontaneously fly across the room, and there's certain things around elasticity, and when you deform objects, they behave in sort of well-understood, well-known ways that civil engineers have been studying for a long time. So what we did is we sort of reframed the problem of non-rigid motion using eigen techniques that basically said we can take a sphere, the sort of perfect object, and deform it by twisting it, tapering it, stretching it in various ways, skewing it, or translating it, rotating it, scaling it, all of those things. And so suddenly you have what was a very unconstrained problem around non-rigid motion. And you say if we limit it to these sort of underlying eigen motions, then we can actually do it. So my own research was around a beating heart, sort of a organic shape that was beating like this, which we used optic flow to sort of track it. And then to describe that volume's change over time, we use these eigen motions. And again, for me, that's sort of a corner case. I think it's not a rich area of research today, non-rigid motion. But what it taught me was sort of how to reframe problems and sort of represent them. And then, of course, deep learning in some ways, instead of having grad students sort of manually decipher these problems and say, what are the eigen faces for this? Now we can work in unconstrained spaces, and instead of grad students, we have deep learning to sort of figure that out from the data itself. So it's sort of interesting to see how we used to be the deep learners, and now algorithms are sort of doing that part for us. But after I got my master's, and I did get one degree there and started the PhD program, there comes sort of a moment of weakness in every PhD student's journey where they're like, this compiler sucks, I have to rewrite it from scratch. They sort of get very distracted. And I was at that moment where I was vulnerable when my old friend Ramesh called and said, would you like to do a company? And at that point, this was 95, it was not common for students to sort of drop out of school and do companies. This whole thing that was happening out here was just getting started. And so I jumped in a car, drove from Cambridge, Massachusetts to California, and took the leap. And I don't know what your situation was at MIT, and I'm not sure this was MIT policy, but my advisor basically said, look, if this company thing doesn't work, and I was pretty sure he thought it wouldn't, you can always slide back into the program.
Yep.
But fortunately, it worked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I think you went from the company that you started, which actually first let's talk a little bit about what you did.
Yeah. I'd love to share a little bit about that. Mostly because we were so utterly clueless, and like we didn't have the benefit of Paul Graham and the sort of well-trodden path. We were sort of out there lost in first principles. So we just took our research out of academia, put a price tag on it, and waited. And of course, nothing happened, But we had built a system that was doing video analysis and took videos and changed them from blobs, which were a backronym, binary large objects in databases, and we sort of cracked them open. We used speech recognition, optical character recognition, scene segmentation, so that you could actually search inside of the video. And so it was an exciting technology, but we had built YouTube 17.0 when the world needed YouTube 1.0. You couldn't click and play a video reliably in 1995. And so we were way ahead of the market, not in a way that I'm proud of or I'm sort of saying is a good thing, but the sort of visceral moment for me was when I went to pitch our system to ABC News. And I sort of was up there for an hour telling them all it could do, and they politely indulged the meeting. And then after the meeting, it sort of broke up, and the lead engineer came over to me and said, "What you're doing is amazing. It's science fiction. We love it. We don't need it." And my heart sank. And he said, "You know what we need though? We need a script that uploads the file to the CDN every night." And I said, "That would take 5 minutes." And he pulled out a chair, and I wrote the script on the spot, and we won them eventually as a customer. And I sort of ran back to the company and I said, "Guys, I figured it out. You don't have to build something that's interesting or even differentiated. You just have to build what they need." And they all sort of shrugged and went back to their research, you know? And I think that's the moment when I really became a product guy as opposed to just a technologist, because I was sort of deep in the customer's problems. And of course, eventually, once we sort of had given them what they needed and what they wanted, that's when our technology came into play. That's when they could utilize and appreciate what we had built. But they had to sort of solve these very tedious, uninteresting problems before they sort of were at a point where our technology had any meaning to them at all. So that was like something I often refer back to, and like a really visceral moment where I think I shifted from a CTO to a product guy. Even though I held the CTO title, I was much more about dragging us back down into the customer problems, and it was something I'll never forget.
Totally. I mean, definitely, like, to your point, the sort of Paul Grahamisms of, you know, build something people want and meeting your customers where they are, you know, that now is percolated through the sort of startup ecosystem, and sort of is relatively canon now. But
yeah.
But those are hard-fought lessons.
Yeah, and I'm sort of glad I figured it out from first principles, sort of on my own. You know, I didn't sort of grow up with that religion. I sort of was a convert, you know, on the spot, and had that transformation. But I've still got my "Make Something People Want" T-shirt, you know, from Paul. So, you know, definitely appreciate that he's taken a whole generation and lifted them up.
Yeah, totally. But I think you know, we'll get into this in a bit. But I'm sure that shaped a lot of the products that you then built that, you know, obviously billions of people use today, and, you know, we'll get to that here in a second.
Yeah.
So you went from you were at the startup, and, you know, it sounds like as you guys built from first principles, and you sort of like learned a lot of how to actually build a business off of a great technology, which is obviously an incredible journey, and really didn't happen very much back then. You know.
Yeah.
The reason that Y Combinator and Paul Graham were so influential is, frankly, that all these things were so unintuitive, especially to builders and makers at the time.
Very true, very true. And I think we were fortunate. We had hyper-competent management, and something that was critical to the success of the company. We had a summer intern that we took on for 3 months, and we sort of begrudgingly took this kid on. He's Stanford MBA, and, you know, we gave him a gig, and it turned out that kid was Peter Fenton, the VC at Benchmark, and he basically rewrote our business plan that became our operating Bible for the next literally years. We sort of, you know, used what we learned from him. So really, really gifted. And I think what was supposed to happen with a startup like ours was you try it for a year and you go, too early, you pivot to something else, or you break it up and do something else. But we sort of had hyper-competent management that managed to actually get us to a sustainable business. We went public in 2000, and then of course, you know, half our customers went under, and we had to go through a pivot more toward enterprise. But those lessons about sort of learning how to survive those hard times and manage through that were incredibly valuable, and very much informed my product sensibilities for the rest of my life. But, you know, taking a company public and the experiences I had there were amazing.
Yeah. I await being able to say that I've done something similar.
Scale is an incredible company, and you've already achieved so much. It's amazing.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then you went from your startup to then go work at, you know, the sort of iconic companies of the Valley. And so I think you went from there to Yahoo.
I went there to Yahoo, and I am certain you are too young to remember this, but Yahoo had it going on at the moment that I got there. It was really an exciting place, and having come from a startup, my plan, which I didn't share in the interview, but was to park at Yahoo for about a year until I was filled up with my next startup idea and then go do another startup. And I think partly because I didn't really envision staying at Yahoo, I had a bit of a devil-may-care attitude. And instead of sort of caring, I just did what I thought was right, and it was sort of my superpower. And as opposed to meeting any resistance, I found Yahoo was like, yeah, keep going. And so really the first thing I did there was I bumped into this small Canadian photo sharing company, Flickr, and I led the acquisition of Flickr and brought them to Yahoo, which was very unexpected because Yahoo already had a photo service that was 3 orders of magnitude bigger than Flickr. But what was happening inside Flickr was, another early company, but local, mobile, social, they had all of the right ingredients. This is even pre-mobile phone, that they were sort of onto this. And there was this whole Web 2.0 movement that was happening at the time, which they were really sort of the poster children for. But I remember meeting the Flickr founders and sitting in the Yahoo cafeteria, and they were polite and said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Oh, computer vision, pixels, images, structure from motion, non-rigid." I sort of ranted for a long time. We try to take pixels and understand what's in them. And at the end, I was like, "And what do you do?" And they said, "Oh, we also take pixels and understand what's in them, but our system is much simpler." And I was like, "Do tell." And they were like, "We just ask people." And they had basically used tagging, and social mechanisms to basically present images to people. And through this sort of culture of generosity, people would type in, "That's a church," or "That's a Gothic church," or "That's a Gothic church in France," and people would annotate pictures with things that would even today be hard for computers. That's a funny image, so they could tell funny. So they had developed this huge database of tagged imagery based on this social construct. And it was at that point, I wanted to go rip up the few diplomas I had and sort of say, like, that is a much more clever idea. And that was another really important moment for me because the data they had collected was amazing. And the insight that people as vision systems sort of have the advantage of evolution, millions of years of evolution, and we can't help not see in general. You drop something and in milliseconds it's recognized and processed. And so this sort of balance between letting computers do what they're good at, but also letting people do what they're good at, and sort of figuring out how do computers add value, but not necessarily entirely replace people, sort of became a theme for my career. And sort of, it's easy to get that balance wrong. Again, my own startup was sort of overweighting the technology and not meeting the people's needs. So sort of figuring out how to set that dial so that the value add of the tech is really making a difference in the product and for the experience of the user has sort of become an ongoing theme. But Flickr was the first of a bunch of amazing companies I found in that Web 2.0 space, and really had an incredible experience at Yahoo. Again, most people have either forgotten or are too young to remember that Yahoo had some incredible talent and incredible momentum. And the most important thing that happened there, of course, was I met my future wife, Irene Au, who was running design there. And she actually had the wisdom to leave Yahoo and go over to Google first. And then I followed her over. I always say I came to Google for love. And she also knew that it was a better fit for me. And she was absolutely right. I sort of partly went to Google to sort of peek behind the curtain, because at the time, when I was considering it in 2007, Google was already successful, already public, already big, and the marketing around it was sort of too good to be true. But when I got there, it was even more exciting, more crazy than I had been led to believe, all in a good way. It was as if two incredibly brilliant, wonderful dropouts designed the company of their dreams with no regard for precedent or protocol, and made it a paradise for people who like to build things. And those were incredibly fun days at Google. And again, while it wasn't early, I got a lot of exposure to the founders and Eric, and really understood how they thought about product. And it was incredibly inspiring and exciting. And again, very much aligned with my nature. So it felt like it was an incredible fit, and just really relished those early days at Google.
Yeah. Well, you touched on, that was awesome. You touched on a few themes that I want to touch on again later. One of which is sort of this balance between humans and machines. And that was the sort of like very early innings. It was like pre-deep learning and even pre-ImageNet, I think. And so it was sort of the very early innings of this thinking through this process of how do you have humans teach machines, not via like grad students, hard coding equations, but in a sort of more abstract way, more direct way. And then obviously very relevant now with all these generative image models and thinking through how that'll change creative processes. And anyway, I'm excited to dig into
totally fascinating.
But at Google, you as you mentioned, you found like this great fit, and many of us will thank you for a lot of the products that you worked on, and were a big part of sort of shaping and building at Google. So Gmail, Google Docs, Voice, Blogger, Photos, News, many of the sort of post-search massive applications and products that Google built. Walk me through the sort of, obviously there was sort of a, not all these happened all at once, but sort of walk me through, some of the stories behind these products and what you were trying to achieve and the sort of unintuitive, realizations as you were sort of building them.
Yeah, it was incredible. And sort of at the level I'm operating, I want to always give full credit to the inventors and the teams that built these. I was helping scale some of these already successful products, and a lot of what you do as management in this context is curate the teams. You build the teams that build the products, so full credit to them. But what I learned from running these massive products, which were scaling toward billion user products, and now many of them are billion monthly active user products, is there's sort of a phase shift when a product gets that large. And I saw this also in management as I started to manage large teams. Teams, I think the phase shift for me is around 1,000. Once you have 1,000 people in your org, things change in a lot of different ways. One is you just sort of have the bell curve of humanity under there. So there's somebody having a baby and people on pat leave and mat leave, but there's also somebody perhaps dying, in that sort of thing. And you have overperformers, but you also have underperformers. And so, sort of seeing that changes a lot about how you manage and how you think about growing that. And I'm sure you've experienced that and more to come with scale. But products that are at that kind of scale, first of all, they immediately become a vector for abuse. And that's one thing that is staggering, the creativity and the arms race of abuse of products that you wouldn't even imagine are abuse vectors. People will figure out a way to use them for steganography and storage and things like that. So that was one sort of awakening. And there's actually a lot of effort expended behind the scenes to run services at this scale, and a lot of AI and machine learning that goes on to sort of win that arms race for users. Another thing you have to sort of deal with, which is just an unfortunate consequence of scale, at any given moment while Google runs its services at many nines of uptime, there's someone who's screwed. And a service like Gmail is like a pacemaker. It's not optional, or calendar. There's some guy in Croatia who's trying to pick his wife up at the airport and can't get to his email. And so there's this sort of background radiation of you can never go to bed at night and sort of say every user is happy. Whereas if you're an enterprise software, you've got 70 CIOs to sort of keep happy at any given instant, and you can keep them mostly happy. Whereas if you have 1 billion users, someone is frustrated or stuck or can't get to their data or can't log in. So you sort of have to figure out triage is sort of the skill. You can no longer people please. You cannot make every one of the 1 billion users happy. So you really have to start looking at the data. This is another real advantage of operating at that scale. Fortunately, you've got dashboards, mirrors, insight every morning as to what's wrong, what's working, what's not. It's such a blessing when you launch features or have the luxury of running tests to be in a data-informed dynamic with your product. And it's, comeuppance for me when I work with very small startups, a couple people in a room, where they don't have the usage that they can actually do that. They're not yet bootstrapped into that. So one of the wonderful consequences about operating at scale is you can sort of enter this wonderful positive feedback loop with data-driven product development. And it doesn't solve all problems. Sort of Google can test 17 shades of blue and pick the one that works best, and that has a tangible revenue impact. And then we can send people to study years later why. We don't care why. That color converts better than the other colors. Maybe it's the glare on the monitor, maybe something else. We don't care. But you're converging towards local maxima. That's not going to lead to disruptive kinds of innovation. So you sort of have to keep doing that even as you're tuning the product based on the data that you get at scale.
Yeah, no, this exact problem is actually one that I've thought a lot about, which is if you purely A/B test your way to you're purely doing A/B test-driven product development, it's the definition of hill climbing, yes. And you'll end up at local maxima, and it can be very uncomfortable to introduce a change that might, from a metrics perspective, land you somewhere worse off, but maybe on a path to even greater.
Exactly, and it takes courage, and it takes care. Again, like when you have a product like Gmail that people live in, use as a dashboard for their life, there's a sort of who moved my cheese sort of thing. We move one pixel, or even when we started the enterprise versions of Gmail, CIOs were not used to software changing overnight. They'd come in one Tuesday and something was different and they didn't authorize the push. What happened? So change management is hard, and you have to be very thoughtful when you do that at scale. And have to balance, I think Stewart at Slack has been very courageous. Almost every change he's made has resulted in uproar, and it's taken time to either figure out we need to roll that back, or that was just change the version and it's actually the right path forward. So I think it takes a lot of patience and skill and courage to sort of navigate those waters.
Yep. Cool. Well, one of the things that you touched on was the sort of like interplay between consumer and enterprise, right? Yeah. And many of the products that your teams worked on have now become huge, large-scale enterprise products. The sort of G Suite, and which includes Docs and Gmail and all these things. So, what do you think that enterprise companies can learn, or enterprise products can learn from consumer products, and even vice versa?
Yeah, that's a fascinating thing. And again, ancient history, but decades ago, when people went to work, they had a sort of corporate issued laptop that was completely locked down. You literally couldn't install software, that, and there wasn't sort of the web as a way to sort of escape from that, situation. You were sort of stuck with the world that your CIO had sort of deployed there. And it was very frustrating because then they'd go home and they had this world of choice, and the cloud is my computer. They actually had a supercomputer that was available to them, Google. And so part of what Google Docs did, and my friend Dave Gerard, who was actually at my startup, he was VP of marketing for my startup Virage, later became president of Google Enterprise, was really responsible for those first efforts of taking Google products and selling them into the enterprise. And it was a very bold and disruptive model, trying to get these companies to move to the cloud. But the strategy was a very explicit: spoil them at home, give them, infinite storage and great search and things like that, and then create a user uprising at work. We demand better, and it worked. Eventually, it took some time. I think one thing we learned is we tried to do it sort of in a self-service way, and said we're not going to hire armies of sales engineers and sort of scale up a sales force and things like that. Ultimately, I think if you look at Google Cloud today, we sort of had to, again, meet the customer where they were at. That's still required to service the needs of enterprises around the world. So Google now has an incredible Google Cloud organization, which is just that. But in those early days, we literally wanted to sort of take the self-same product that we had built for consumers, make a few adaptations like LDAP integration, put your logo up there and things like that, and give them the same product. I think it's fascinating because I do think this flips and flops, like sometimes enterprise is where things are happening and they have the best equipment and they have best access, and then it migrates to consumer. But this sort of interplay between consumer and enterprise is really to the benefit of both, because what you're really, at the end of the day, we're humans, and largely my distinction between my work self and my personal self is blurred, and even more so these days. And so I think creating products for humans is the right strategy, whether at work or at play.
Yeah. And this exact phenomenon that you mentioned, it's actually interesting to think about in the context of AI, where a lot of there's a lot of AI functionality that's actually built into, frankly, a lot of the products that you worked on, but is built into, at a low level, many of the sort of consumer products that we use, and are basically built in ways that make our lives easier. And then if you think about the enterprise use cases, or sort of like, in particular, the big tech companies, they have just incredibly powerful algorithms that are sort of deployed in these astronomical ways that drive just massive amounts of value and are sort of very, very powerful. And one of the trends I'm excited about over the next, call it 5 years, is this diffusion of the sort of best-in-class AI technology, which is really exists within these like incredible AI labs and the best sort of AI organizations in the world, and the diffusion of that across all of our both consumer and enterprise experiences over time. So
yeah, I think it is the responsibility of these researchers to really platformize that. That is both the opportunity and the responsibility, and we'll see a blossoming once that really happens. And I mean, scale is at the forefront of that. What you guys are doing is really taking functionality that was the purview of the few, and you're making it available to many, many more people. And that is, again, I think both an opportunity, but also a responsibility, and that's where we'll see great innovation. I can't remember, I think was it Bill Joy who said, not all the smart people in the world work at Sun. Not all the smart people in the world work at Google or anywhere in particular. There's a lot of opportunity out there, and it gets really exciting when you create a platform, and that's why I'm excited about scale.
Yeah, we're excited to bring this technology more broadly. So one of the things I would be awesome to talk about as well at Google. Obviously, there was these sort of smashing successes in Gmail, Google Docs, etc. There were also some products that ended up being sunset, like Google Plus, Google Wave, which were very innovative products for sure. Like I remember Google Wave felt, very, very futuristic and powerful.
And had a lot of the right ideas. I think one thing you learn is that having the right ideas is not sufficient. Again, back to being too early. A lot of this has to do with whether the world and users and even society is ready to absorb these products. So there's a great documentary called General Magic, the movie. And General Magic basically invented the smartphone 10 years before the iPhone existed. And one of the amazing things about it is the cohort of talent that they assembled to do that. Andy Hertzfeld, who built the Mac, Tony Fadell, who went to do the iPod, iPhone, Andy Rubin, Piero Midyar, Megan Smith, John Gianandrea, like amazing people who went on to do amazing things. And if you look at that movie, the punchline is sort of they got everything right. They had the capacitive screen, they had the interface right, the form factor was right, but the world wasn't ready. And that both means the networks weren't ready, the manufacturing wasn't quite there, the costs and price points weren't there. So there was sort of a turn of the technical generation that had to happen. But I also think society wasn't quite ready for that product. And it's interesting that Tony went on to do the iPod, and that was sort of the first normalization of people carrying around computers in their pockets, not just geeks or Bluetooth in your ear sort of techies, but everybody loves music, and music is sort of the arbiter of cool in our society. So the iPod was able to sort of normalize that, and the growth of the iPhone out of that was sort of an interesting thing to follow. But that movie is a great lesson in sort of the consequences of being too early. And the right thing to do, of course, is to sunset these things. It's not to sort of keep pushing against the immovable force, but you basically harvest the lessons and move forward with those lessons. So Google Plus as an example, the product I'm most proud of at Google is Google Photos. And partly because of the arc of my career, I've been looking at imaging, computer vision, video, and photos for the whole time. And in the intervening years since Flickr, we had the innovations you talked about, ImageNet and deep learning, and suddenly computer vision started to work, as opposed to sort of pushing 1%, suddenly it was working sort of in the way you would hope for and expect. And we had a chance to sort of rescue, like a phoenix from the ashes of Google Plus, a photos product that was languishing in that context. And it took a ton of discipline to do that, product discipline. And part of it is the original Google Photos was built for a previous generation. And there's even a problem with dog fooding at Google. We had a lot of Google executives and even Google founders who'd invested in tens of thousands of dollars of high-resolution photo imagery kit. So we would get feedback like, it's failing on my gigapixel image. And you're the only one who has a gigapixel image. The rest of the world had moved toward mobile. And so it took quite a bit of product discipline, and I really credit the team, David Lieb, Anil Sabharwal, for sort of sticking to their guns and building a product that was sort of in harmony with where the world was headed. And also dealing with the constraints. Instagram was already successful, so you already had a place to sort of humble brag and sort of put your public photos. So really rethinking personal photo management. And then the thing I'm most proud of, again, is this sort of balance between using computer vision. Like, we don't sort of throw that front and center in the product. It is an invaluable feature. And the fact I can say, show me pictures of my daughters on the beach from Christmas 3 years ago, and Google Photos both understands the natural language aspects of that, but automatically, without any tagging, understands the semantic content there is extraordinary and really, really gratifying to me. But that technology has been sort of put in the right context, and it's important that Google Photos does all the other things I need it to do, like syncing and transcoding and showing up on all my devices and making it easy to share, which are not AI or machine learning, but are enabled by that, because now I can do these queries where I show me on my Google Home device all of my vacation photos. So it comes in, but it comes in at the right moment and in the right value add. And again, I sort of think of a lot of this as AI is the spice. Like a dessert with saffron is amazing, and saffron is a very expensive and hard to come by spice. But you don't sit there and eat a bowl of saffron. And you don't start with saffron and say, how can I design a product around saffron? You sort of bring it in at the right moment, and then the magic happens.
Yep. Yeah. Which is super relevant, actually, to a direction, something I definitely want to ask you, which is, definitely the sort of AI as sort of like empowering the products rather than AI being the product is like I think a critical thing for all builders of AI technology to really have in mind. Your product has to be able to stand on its own legs, and AI can be an enabler for a magical user experience. What were some of the most underrated features or functionality that you were able to build at Google using machine learning that were sort of, again, kind of magical user experiences, but it sort of empowered the overall product?
Well, I'll tell you one that I love, which I had nothing to do with, but I use not every day, because I don't get in a car every day, but almost every time I get in a car, I use Waze. And Waze is an incredible product. They did reach that critical mass in that virtuous cycle where there's enough Wazers on the road contributing data and enough phones that Google has data from, where it does an incredible job, like to the minute of predicting my commute across 3-hour commutes. So it can tell me how long will it take for me to be in Sea Ranch or Big Sur or whatever, down to the minute. And that is extraordinary, and it takes into account real-time conditions, historical conditions, anticipates the impact of a particular accident will have on my commute, routes me around. Like, for me, that is one of the most magical experiences. That is really an example of a product where it's easy to underestimate the amount of tech that's involved in doing that as well as it's done, and the sort of virtuous cycle that has to develop for that to work. It's close to my heart because it's how I got up to your office today.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of broader use cases, you've now kind of had a chance to not only have multiple leadership opportunities in a number of different industries and product areas, but also now you've been investing in a lot of companies and sort of exploring the world, as it were, more broadly across many industries. Based on what you've seen, what are the areas where you think AI has some of the greatest potential for good for humanity?
Yeah. So both my wife and I do a lot of angel investing. We have over 100 angel investments now, and she is now at Khosla Ventures, which I think is one of the most interesting and innovative firms. I mean, Vinod is just an incredible human, incredible technologist, incredible investor. So just even having proximity to Vinod has taught us a lot about the ability to apply technology to solve problems for people. I think there are so many areas, and I think Paul Graham, I think over the weekend, tweeted, as interesting and fascinating as AGI is, the real opportunity is in all of these sort of underdeveloped markets where AI can come in and solve problems for people. And a few that I've just sort of happened into, logistics. Like, I was talking to someone who had an application for rail, cargo moving on rail. And it turns out that a lot of how a rail yard works today in 2022 is a dude with a clipboard sort of, managing the egress of the rail cars. And like, it's embarrassing because this is like literally a packet switching computer science problem that we could optimize. But a lot of these industries are still at the clipboard. Shipping is another one, which is like amazingly antiquated and hard to change. So I'm looking for these opportunities to sort of come in to these places where I know AI can make a big difference, but they have not yet been privy. They're sort of, it's trickling down to them. An example of a company I invested in is called Tive. Tive builds a device which is sort of the size of an iPhone, and it goes in shipping containers, and it measures everything. Temperature, it's got GPS in there, builds a mesh network to talk to other ones so that it has connectivity when it's on a freighter moving across the sea. I mean, there's just so much we can glean from understanding commercial shipping. And today, you as a consumer can sort of track where your package is with UPS or DHL. Most commercial shipping is like a black box. You wave goodbye at the port, and you pray it makes it over to Orange County or wherever it's going to land. And so the amount of data that you can sort of generate once we sort of instrument all of these things is another huge opportunity. One that I'm really excited about is healthcare. I think Google has been humbled in healthcare. It is so exciting, the opportunities that AI will provide in healthcare, and so maddening that we live in a system where that opportunity is impeded by some perverse interests of parties there. I'm actually hopeful that outside of the United States, there might be the ability to sort of move more quickly, but I think it's an interesting puzzle how we get out of the and this again has nothing to do with technology, but how we get out of the system we're in terms of healthcare in this country and into a place where we can start to bring these state-of-the-art opportunities to users. So I've done at least a dozen sort of health-related things, everything from Mammoth Biosciences to Suki, which is using sort of voice technologies in a clinical context. But I think health is one of the most exciting places because there's that direct opportunity to help people. The tech is ready, and we just have to get the systems ready.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. Like, one of the things that I talk about all the time is globally, there's a 10x shortage of doctors. 9 out of 10 people in the world who need medical care from a doctor are unable to receive it. And that's not a problem that you solve with medical training. It's a problem you solve through artificial intelligence and applying the tech and algorithms to sort of solving that problem. And to your point, the tech is there.
Yeah.
It's very technically feasible, and the question is just how you get the system to actually work.
Yeah, and I think an interesting conversation around the balance between humans and when doctors are a scarce resource, like what you really want to do is optimize their time. So while I'm not necessarily ready to go into surgery from a diagnosis from an algorithm, I think what the algorithm can do is say, here are 99 images and these 3 deserve the bulk of your attention, and sort of rank order them so that the limited resource, the doctor's attention, can be applied where it's most useful. So sort of like self-driving. I do drive a Tesla, and I'm not ready to seed control and let it navigate me all the way up here. 99.99% accurate means it kills you once an hour, basically. But as a cruise control, rebranded and sort of thinking about it in a different context, it's the best experience I've ever had. So when things got stop and go as I turned off 6th, it drove for me, and it was fantastic. I couldn't completely take my attention off, but that's the right way to think about it, and I'm very happy with that level of performance because it lets me sort of apply my attention in the right way. And attention is sort of like the most valuable thing we have, right? They're not minting any more of it. So if an algorithm can help me sort of refocus it in a way that makes me more productive or returns things back, that's important. And actually, there's a funny anecdote there. As we think about medical, and I sort of said like it's the most direct way to help people. At Google, there was a time when Larry Page was CEO when we focused so much on latency. And he was just on a rampage. He's like, I can't believe Gmail takes 3 seconds to load. And I'm not sure if I recall the math, but my recollection is 1 second times a billion users. If you add that up, a billion seconds is 33 years. So if you're sort of like changing the load time from 2 seconds to 1 second for a billion users, you're actually saving lives because you're handing back time that people would have been staring at a spinning logo. You're sort of returning it to them. So as mundane as the things we do in big tech are, in some ways we're saving lives just by returning people's attention to them in bulk. And then what they do with that is hopefully up to them, but becoming more productive, spending more time with their family, putting it to good use.
Totally. I mean, that's some of what you get from operating at just incredible scale. I want all the way on the other side of the spectrum. I think one of the areas that is incredibly exciting right now are generative applications of AI. So these sort of diffusion models, in particular, is also the large language models for text generation, diffusion models for image generation, like DALL-E 2 or Midjourney or Stable Diffusion or whatnot. Putting your product hat on for a second and sort of also your sort of like consumer-oriented hat on. What do you think of these technologies? What do you think of some of the potential, and what do you think are some of the directions that we're going to be able to take sort of this incredible breakthrough in technology?
Well, I think immediately I see product opportunity for DALL-E and other generative image opportunities. Like, who among us hasn't, when making a presentation, use Google image search and sort of, grab something? And I've always, done my best to find Creative Commons licensed work, but that puts an additional constraint and makes it, very hard pulling from a limited palette or buying from stock. Wouldn't it be great to sort of generate an image that is not just close, but the perfect image for what it is you're trying to do? I think part of the problem there, again, is less of a tech problem and more of a IP societal problem. So, if I say, make me an image in the style of Picasso, and the model, it's not a Picasso, but it has been trained on Picasso content, What does that mean for the IP rights there, and not even in a legal sense, but just in an ethical, moral sense? So these are not generated out of thin air. There's sort of a lot of data that has been fed in, and so it's sort of two hops away from that source data. But what claims can the original owners make around derivative works of that sort? So I think a lot of what we have to figure out is how that works. And same with large language models and generative text. What is mine and what is the models, and what are the people who fed the data to the models, and like the sort of rights around that are going to take a while to sort of sort through, and I think are the bigger problem, because I think the technology is immediately valuable and useful. And it's, again, stunning how quickly, over a course of months, really, I've watched that become the case.
Totally. So one of the things that you've done now, we obviously talked about, was your angel investing. I think you and your wife have made over 100 angel investments, and including some very successful companies like our former tenant Slack. What is your approach to investing been, and how has your all the time that you spent in product sort of informed your view on investing?
We are sort of hobbyist investors. We don't have a fund. It's just personal capital, and mostly the checks we write are not going to pay for coffee for a company like Scale. So we use it as an excuse to align our interests with the company's interest, and then do what we love, which is sort of helping people. And the most gratifying thing to me is when something that is a modest effort for me, whether it's an introduction or a product experience I've had, can make a big difference for someone else. Like, that's when you can feel really great. Like, you don't have to make the mistakes I've already made. I made them for you, and I can sort of give you the wisdom without the scars and the pain of actually going through them. And so we think about our investing like that. I think it definitely starts with the people. The story of Slack for me is really a bet on Stewart. I never saw a business plan for Slack because he didn't have a business plan for Slack. He was building a video game that looked something like Roblox meets World of Warcraft, meets LSD. And for 5 years he pursued that, and only in year 5 did he pivot. And so for me, it was a really great lesson. Stewart is a product genius. He's someone who I would bet on as many times as he'd let me. And it was an incredible journey and incredibly fun to bear witness to his genius there. So I look mostly for people. And so for probably my first 40 investments, it was easy because I invested in my friends. People would be leaving Google, or people I knew from Yahoo or MIT would start companies, and they'd invite us to put a small check in. And then, sort of ran into a wall. I ran out of friends, basically. I'm just not that popular, not that well known. So I had to get a little more proactive in terms of helping create deal flow. And again, my wife, she's also hired and ran design at Google and Yahoo, and was at Netscape before that. So she has a tremendous network. And so really, through our personal networks, we get exposure to a lot. But it always starts with the person. So is this someone we want to work with, someone we'd enjoy spending time with, someone who has something to teach us, but also maybe we can offer something too. That sort of great blend, that jam session where it's not a one-way relationship, but sort of an opportunity to grow together. And there's been no shortage. We've done, I think, over 140 investments now, and in that cohort, over 20 unicorns, and things are going really well from that perspective. But the most gratifying thing is when we can be helpful. Tony Fidel, who's a friend, and we do a lot of investing together, sort of said, we're paying them to take our advice, and that's sort of how it works. And that hopefully works for both parties.
Yeah, I actually remember. First of all, I've been deeply appreciative for the time that we've gotten to spend together in this vein. In you providing advice for myself and the Scale team as we've gone along. But I remember, I think the first or second time we spoke, there was something that you said that actually has always stuck with me, which is. It was a statement about management, and it was sort of like, there's there's lots of different kinds of people, but there's sort of two kinds of people in the world. There's folks who, if they went on a trip and they got a flat tire, that's it's like the story of their life, and they'll tell their friends about it jovially, and it'll sort of be this fun, sort of zany story. And there are folks who, it'll ruin their day, it'll ruin their week, it'll ruin their year. And it was such a coherent way to, I think, describe something that I think is very intuitive for a lot of us, just, having gotten the chance to interact with a lot of people. And I think your advice was to build a team of as many of the people who would find a flat tire as a story of their life, because ultimately any startup is lots of bumps and fits and starts.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially things that are out of your control, the macro conditions. Like a startup, like almost any worthwhile endeavor, is sort of this dance between your own self-effort and the universe, what's coming back at you. And you sort of have to be in harmony with that. And like you're saying, it's trouble is inevitable, and you're going to have conditions well out of your control that you're going to have to deal with. And finding people who make that fun, enjoyable, and do it with skill, run into the burning house as opposed to run from it, those are the kind of people you love to work with. And I feel so blessed because I've had so many mentors and people I've worked with that have inspired me and taught me that, the right kind of failure is an option. If we can learn from it, move on, become stronger, and use it to fuel the next innovation, that's the way to think about the flat tire. It's, again, a story we'll tell for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I wanted to close, again, in our theme on some advice, actually, for folks watching. So, with all of your wisdom in product, I think a lot of people want to grow in their sort of product capabilities and ultimately, have the opportunity to influence and work on, some of the biggest products in the world. What advice would you give to somebody who is sort of an aspiring product person?
I would say, in a nutshell, beginner's mind. I think we're all great product people, and part of it is getting that sort of fresh view onto your product. What happens when you get close to a problem is you start to understand why things are broken. And we can't fix that because that's the way the infrastructure works and it would be too hard. And we start to become snowblind and make excuses for why our product isn't great. And it takes a lot of courage and sort of freshness. And that's why new users are great. And that's why spending time with users are great. They don't know your infrastructure won't allow you. They just like, why can't I, So becoming a good listener and seeing things through their eyes. But I think the myth of sort of like some of us have it and some of us don't, like this sort of turtleneck wearing product savant, I sort of don't buy. I think we all have the skill, and it's just whether you're in touch with it, whether you have the courage to sort of see what's wrong with your product and then advocate for it. That you can't just sort of see it and accept it. You have to become doggedly determined to sort of push through all the reasons why you can't do something and aspire to greatness. But I think that's the advice I'd like to offer today anyways, is sort of see your product through fresh eyes, stop making excuses, and fix it.
Yep, yeah. Awesome. And the last question is, obviously, we walked through your story at both Michigan and MIT, working on, first of all, anything that you could do with the computer, and then computer vision and sort of non-rigid motion, and continuing to explore those areas. If you were to give advice to somebody who's sort of just starting in their, post-high school schooling, so starting their freshman year, what would you encourage them to study and why?
For me, I'm super grateful that there are people that have gone super deep in algorithms, and I am the beneficiary of their work, and it's so great at Google to be surrounded by people who literally wrote the book, and that's incredible. For me, where I have found most joy is sort of being diverse in my interest. And again, I think in terms of the next generation of startups, it's going to be from people who sort of mash up, I guess at MIT they called it not interdisciplinary, but anti-disciplinary, the white space that lives between sort of existing things is fascinating and sort of filled with opportunity. So one thing I would say, when I was in college, I became very insular. I sort of sampled, but I live kitty corner from Stanford, and every day there's a talk there from a Nobel Prize winning economist or anthropologist or a computer scientist. And I think my advice is to take advantage of what exposure you have wherever you are. And we've all hopefully got the internet, so there's just so much out there, but take advantage of it. Don't sort of become insular and sort of, burrow down. Remember that you live in a context of a society and a marketplace of ideas, and there's a lot of great opportunity sort of mashing these things up. So my advice is not necessarily to stay in school. I think school is a interesting institution. We're both dropouts. Most of my heroes are dropouts. So school may be the place to do that, but it also might be well beyond school. But it's to get out there, be curious, and sort of see where that curiosity leads.
Yeah, great advice. Well, thanks so much for coming and chatting with me today, Bradley. It was a pleasure. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's always great to spend time together.